So for some years, I was on the board of an organization that was called Center for a New American Dream. Now they're called
Hmm.
New Dream. And the executive director was interested in making a series of these animated videos where the author did some speaking and wrote the script, and then somebody drew as the author spoke. So it was a very interesting experience for me. I'd never done anything quite like it before, and so it was a lot of fun to work with the artists and to develop what the drawings would look like. Essentially, what happened was I wrote the script first and then recorded it, and then the artists sat down and gave some sketches, and then eventually we ended up with the video that we had. So, which is done far better than any of us ever dreamed, I think. I mean, it certainly doesn't have the 20 million views that a latest kitten video has, but for what it is, it's done pretty well. The other thing I'd say is it actually really became an inspiration for my most recent book too. So my most recent book is called Hypercapitalism, and it's told entirely in cartoon format. And so
Right.
it's a collaboration with a cartoonist. It doesn't animate, obviously, being a book, but that animation had done so well that I thought, oh, well, maybe that could be the format for this particular project I was working on when that book came out in January of 18. So.
Of 2018. Yes, I saw that. Fantastic. Could you just tell us a bit more about the book, actually?
Sure. So the book is co-authored with a guy named Larry Gonick, who's
Mhm.
made his career for 20, 30 years doing nonfiction cartooning. So he's probably best known for the cartoon history of the universe, but he's also done cartoon guides on statistics and chemistry and physics and things like that. And so the book is really in two parts. The first part of the book is an analysis of the current state of our political, economic, social system in certainly in the United States and much of the rest of North America and Western Europe and the world, so which we call hypercapitalism. And so we
Mhm.
try to describe what the basic principles of hypercapitalism are, and then we lodge that in the research that my colleagues and I and others have done for the last 20 years about values. So the fundamental premise of the first part of the book is that the values of our economic system, with their focus on money and status and consumption and power and competition, are the very values that tend to undermine ecological sustainability, that undermine pro-social civil behavior, that undermine well-being. And there's a great deal of research which supports that basic idea. So that's kind of what the first part of the book does. And then the second part of the book is all about solutions. So solutions that people are trying in their own personal lives or in organizations or in cities or in governments that are organized around trying to create lifestyles or businesses or economies or governments which are more focused on those healthy, sustainable values instead of the hyper capitalistic, materialistic values.
Fantastic. And so, who is your audience? Who are you aiming at
Yeah,
mostly?
well, I would say I was aiming for kind of the hip, socially conscious late high schooler, early college student,
Uh-huh.
as well as people probably into their 20s who appreciate, comics. I mean, I think it's a book that I've heard that children as young as 8 have read it by now. So a
Yes.
father who read it with his kid, um, I heard about that, and I'm sure older people are reading it too. I think one of the things I've learned in my teaching over the years is that capitalism is the water in which we swim. And so a lot of people don't really actually understand what its basic principles are and how it operates. Like they
Right.
know it's there, but they don't really know, what Adam Smith said about it, or they don't know the big shifts that happened in capitalism, especially after World War II. And so just trying to lay that out really clearly for people. And I think it's also oriented for people who know there's something wrong, but can't quite put their finger on what to do instead.
Right.
And I think there's that famous Margaret Thatcher idea of there is no alternative, right? But really there are lots and lots of alternatives, and so I think we're aiming to try to get to broaden people's ideas for people who are searching for something that would be better and more sustainable and less soul sapping and more connecting.
Yeah, no, because I mean, like even going back to this conference that we had in Addis, the idea is, about telling, scientific stories or the environment or these kind of things. We have to find different ways of storytelling, so it's not
Yes.
the same, right? And I think this is what you've achieved.
Well, that's hopefully achieved. That's certainly what
Yes.
we tried. I think one of the things, this was actually the third attempt I had made to write the book. So I first
Okay.
started trying to write the book back in 2008, and it wasn't working, and I set it aside. And then I tried again around 2011, and it wasn't working, and I set it aside. And and the reason I came to, and this was part of where that animated video came in, was that once I saw that animated video had what, like 300,000, 400,000 views in just a couple of months, that compared to the scientific papers that I've written, okay, that's a lot. And
Yes.
so I thought, my problem with those earlier iterations of the book, they were kind of too dry, they were too, I don't know. I just didn't believe people were really going to read them, right? But when you read Larry Gonick's other work, and part of
Hmm.
why I approached him about it is, he has a way of taking material that otherwise could seem pretty dry and enlivening it with cartoons, enlivening it with stupid little puns, or visual puns that are fun, while at the same time, and this was what was so important to me, maintaining the integrity of the content, right?
Right.
That from my perspective, the science has to always come first, right?
Right.
And the facts have to always come first. But then it's a matter of how can you convey them to people in a way which hopefully they'll listen. And of course, as a teacher, that's always my problem, right? Every time I step in front of the classroom. But you have a different kind of problem when you're writing a book. So I hope that the book was succeeds in that. The great news from my perspective is it's already been translated into Korean and French,
Oh, cool.
and I hear that a Turkish version is on the way too. So we'll see what happens.
Very nice. And anyway, you just can buy it from Amazon anywhere, right? So here in Nairobi, if you order it.
Yeah, and you can order it in ways other than Amazon too. So
Okay, great.
yes.
Yeah, very good. Okay, no, because I mean, even in schools here, this is what's important. It's education. Everything needs to start when they're younger. And I think what you're trying to teach is the consciousness and awareness of how we live on this planet. We just don't follow what we've been told, you
Well,
know?
ideally, yeah. I think the problem is that too often people do follow what they've been told, and what they've been told over and over is the path to happiness is consumption, the path to success is to make as much money as possible. And again, what the real problem is that the research shows that the more that you focus on those kinds of values, the more those sustainable values are suppressed, the lower your people's well-being, et cetera. So we really need a new, one of the working title for the book was A Revolution of Values, which comes
Hmm.
from a speech that Martin Luther King Jr. made not long before he was assassinated, where he was talking about the problems of materialism and how they're intertwined with militarism and racism and all of the rest. And what we really need is, a shift in what we think is important, a shift in what we put our priorities on. And of course, kids in particular, they're still forming their value systems, right? And you
Right.
see it in your young kids, and I certainly see it in the all the students I teach and in my own college age sons. And so, if we don't provide people with another set of ideas about what's important, then capitalism is happy to step in and
Right.
socialize them towards materialism.
Right. Very true. And so what's your feeling at the moment, even like in general in the planet, in terms of us trying to find this shift? Do you
You mean, am I optimistic or am I
Yeah, I
pessimistic? What
guess
are you
so.
asking
I
exactly?
guess so.
It really
How
depends.
do you
It really depends on the day. There are some days when I look at the trends and I think, wow, a lot of stuff is headed in the wrong direction. But then I look at other trends and look at, how environmentally aware people are now. I look at the success of things like benefit corporations or alternative indicators of progress, or that people still make choices to live in a voluntarily simple lifestyle, or pushes for more equality and all of the rest. And I think these are ongoing struggles that have, some of these at least are ongoing struggles that have been going on for a long, 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 long time, right? They're historical, right? And but I think when you look at the grand sweep of things, historically, humanity goes through a lot of nasty stuff,
Right.
especially when you look at the 20th century. But we're still here, and
Right.
we're making progress. And I think there's a lot of hand wringing that happens sometimes by people both on the left and on the right, which is usually not very productive, and would be better spent getting down to work and trying to create something new. And I think that's one of the things that does give me some hope, is kind of that creative impulse that we humans have. And the other thing that I have to say, that, and I say this a lot, that gives me a lot of hope, is that, so from the values research that we do, what we contrast those materialistic values with what we call intrinsic values. And those are values for your own personal growth, for your connection to your family, and then for helping the world be a better place. And what we know is that, first off, people generally tend to say that they prefer intrinsic values to materialistic values. We know that the more that people focus on intrinsic values, the happier they are and the less depressed they are. We know that people who focus on intrinsic values act in more pro-social ways, and we know that people who act on intrinsic values act in more ecologically sustainable ways. So it's actually a relatively simple solution when it all boils down, right? Is that if we can shift our own lifestyles and shift our communities and shift our business patterns and shift our politics to be one that's more focused around these intrinsic values, that's going to suppress materialistic values, and it's going to promote well-being, civil society, and sustainability. Now, it's not the whole solution. I'm not so naive as to think that, but it's a coherent solution. It's a solution which has many multiple benefits for people. And, compared to other kinds of solutions, it's actually, I think, simple and possible. So we'll see what happens.
Right. Thank you. Sorry. Okay, I told you it was an interview. Say hi. Give me
Bye.
1 second. Hi. Okay, thank you.
Bye bye.
Yeah, so we definitely have to edit.
Well, it would be cute to have him come in.
It would be, I guess so. We're going to edit it in a way. Um, yes, so I don't know if we cut us off when we were talking
I
about the
think I was
intrinsic
pretty
value.
much at the end. I think we were pretty
Oh,
good. Yeah.
okay, great. But then you also went a step further. I saw that, about advocating for policies. So it's also, you said, changing or shifting our intrinsic values, but then also going a step further where, we have to also go on the government level too. It's
Yeah,
not
I think that's
just.
right. Yeah, to me, one of the big critiques I've made over the years of kind of the environmental movement, is sometimes they are too focused just on, simple lifestyle changes, right? Just change your light bulbs or recycle or whatever,
Right.
and that's clearly not sufficient. And on the other hand, kind of the success, at least in my country,
Yeah.
of making changes in policy has not been great, right? And so I think that ultimately what needs to happen is that individual people, of course, we need to change our own lifestyles. Of course, we need to change how we consume. Of course, we need to change what we're invested in our retirement funds, right? But we need to get more involved.
We should be fine.
Were they
Sorry.
were they screams
Okay.
of joy or of pain there? I couldn't quite tell. Oh, you there? You're frozen. Ready?
Okay, go.
Good. So my view is, of course, we need to make individual changes in our own lifestyle. We need to consume differently. We need to invest our retirement funds differently. We need to recycle and all those kinds of things. But I think what's clear is that's insufficient. It definitely buys into this capitalist idea that it's all about a bunch of individuals behaving in an economic fashion. But we need to move beyond that, obviously. And I think that policies are the place where we do need to move beyond that. And one of the things, I've been thinking a lot about with regard to policies lately is that, there are actually policies at multiple levels. There's policies at your workplace, right? There's policies in your city. There's policies in your state or your province. There's policies, of course, at the federal level. And I think one of the things that, in my mind, that I would encourage sort of the average person to do more is to be thinking about policies like in their organization and in their cities and where they live, actually, because it's really, 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 really hard to make changes at federal policy levels or at international policy, and we know that. But chances are you actually might be able to sit down and talk to your city council person face to face, right? And there's so much interesting that's happening at city levels right now with regard to issues around ecological sustainability and with regard to putting intrinsic values into the way that people are living their lives. And one of the things that's most fascinating to me is how it's happening in cities that have both mayors who are conservative and liberal. You can see it in a lot of different places. And so, it's also a good practice ground. One of the things I tell my students when they're kind of complaining about policy stuff, I say, well, let's try to change my college. Let's try to change our college, because if we can't change Knox College, we're never going to change the world, right?
Right.
It's never going to be easier than what you have right now to change Knox College. Not to say it will be easy, but
Right.
that's true at any college. It's going to be hard to make changes, but compared to changing your city, it's going to be easy. Compared to changing your state, it's going to be easy. But get that practice and work on that policy level, and it's meaningful, I think. And unfortunately, people too often think that, oh, it's got to be at the federal level because it's carbon floating in the atmosphere, and at some level that is true, but the changes we make in our own cities are important too. And I think that most also really importantly, they can snowball up. You take a look at what's
Right.
happened in the U.S. over the last 10 years with regard to marijuana and with regard to gay marriage.
Mm.
It was eventually that the federal government caught up to what was happening at the city and the state level, right? And so if you can do it at city and state levels or province levels and demonstrate that it works, then other cities and states kind of follow along, and then eventually the federal government will catch up.
Right. Very interesting. I mean, I was just thinking about saying, what's your take on, like, in terms of how, the world thinks in general, like the recent thing with Notre Dame and, the flooding in Mozambique, for example, and how the world, in terms of materialism, would, hand out a lot of money for something that, and then for things that are actually important, the environment or, humanity, it's lacking.
Yeah, I think that part of the problem is that, the hole in the roof of Notre Dame or the floods in villages in Mozambique, you can totally see them, right? They're right there. They're very material things, right?
Right.
And one of the things that I've long said is that, money does solve money problems, right? And so those were, fixing Notre Dame Cathedral is a money problem, right?
Right.
Um, but, things like carbon or things like species extinction, they're hard to see. They're very difficult to see, right? It's hard to see that there are only so many lions left in Kenya, and pretty much all of them have names, from what I understand, right? I mean,
Right.
it's just not wide and wild like it was.
Right.
And the same is true for all kinds of other environmental problems. And so I think that that's a big reason why we don't make as much success in those issues as we do for these smaller, more delimited issues, right? I mean, I know it's a big deal to try to fix the roof of Notre Dame or to fix the villages in Mozambique, but they're delimited problems. right? They're small, relatively speaking, in terms of time and space, you know, and so therefore you can have hope that you can get them done. Which is another reason why, again, I think working at the city level and working at your own organization level is really worthwhile, you know, because you can actually make some progress on things, and that helps build hope, and hope is a motivator to then go do the next thing. And one of the great things about our species is that we're really good at imitating what other people do. And that's a real problem under hypercapitalism, right? Because what we imitate is that we all want that thing. We all want more and more and more and more and more because that's what we're seeing in our social surround. But if what people can start to see in their social surround, you know, a voluntary simplicity activist I knew many years ago once said to me, you know, Tim, what we have to do is show them that our way is more fun. Okay.
Mm,
You know, and if we can show them that our way is more fun, then people are going to want to do it. Right. And
right.
but the only way we can show people it's more fun to live this way is to go and live it. Right. You know, is to make those changes in our lives and to make it easier for people in their communities to also do it.
Right, right. I agree. I mean, there's something I think that's important also to mention in terms of like developing countries or, you know, continents like here in Africa where, you know, things are booming and the I feel we're losing our values and our morals very fast because it's all about the new car and success. And, you know, we've been down for a long time and, you know, money's coming in, the economy's growing. But so the ethos that's going on is exactly, you know, the capitalism, consumerism, materialism, big billboards. But there's also an opportunity to kind of maybe try and stop that before it gets too large. But I don't know
Yes.
if it's going to happen because we are on this trajectory where we're trying to be the next, you know, frontier of capitalism in a way.
Right. Yes. With all the Chinese investment coming in and all of the
Right.
undeveloped land that there is in Africa, relatively speaking, right? Especially compared to, you know, Southeast Asia, et cetera. Yeah. I mean, I agree. And I think that Africa is, you know, potentially the last place where we can make a stand. And you know, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, is that what we know about value systems is the more that people focus on those materialistic values for money and status and consumption, it ends up suppressing those pro-social values. It ends up suppressing those pro-ecological values. That's the way that the human mind works, the data
Mhm.
suggest. So I think what's necessary, so to the extent that business leaders and political leaders say, let's go down this capitalist path as quick and fast as we can,
Right.
the suppression of those pro-social and pro-ecological values is going to be the natural consequence. It's going to be the cost. Okay, that's what's going to happen. And we've seen it over and over in history, and we see it in experiments, and we see it in what we know about the human value system. But that doesn't mean it's inevitable, because if political leaders and business leaders and the people step in and say, well, wait a second, we've seen what's happened in all of these other countries, and yeah, they got a lot of nice stuff, right? But look at what happened to their societies, look what happened to their families, look what happened to their wildlife, look what happened to their skies, like in China, or their water. Okay, is that really the path that we want to go down?
Right.
And what can we do in order to balance the need to feed our people, which is a real need in Africa, right? Okay, with the need to maintain these other values too. And I think that's the fundamental question. That really is the fundamental question. And the problem is, can we have business and political leaders who will either have the guts to go and say that,
Right.
or who will be responsive to the people who are trying to push them to make solid policy, which balances the need for economic growth with all the other things that one might care about.
Right. Thank you for your time.
You betcha. And thanks for finding a time there. I'm sure it's kind of late in Kenya or right now. So
Little bit. Yeah,
yeah,
it's
okay.
fine. But thank you so much.